So I'm thrilled to be here. I want to talk about a few things. And really I'm going to take you on a journey. So I'm going to try to seam some of the things that you've heard today together, and I'm going to try to put it in a story in such that I'm going to talk about the acceleration of innovation, the acceleration of how do you get new ideas, but how do you get them into the world faster? And somebody once said that you're in danger of becoming irrelevant when the speed of the outside world is moving faster than the speed inside. And I think, I take that very seriously, and I think we ought to think about, is your organization designed to move fast? Because we haven't talked a whole lot about speed today, but I think of it like this. This is what, on the left side of this chart, is what most of our organizations have been trained to do as we think about change, right? We think of change as something that comes, and you can be thoughtful and planful and methodical about how to enact a change plan. But the reality is it's much more like this today, right? It's sudden, it's a burst, it's unpredictable, it's unanticipated. It could come from everywhere from a technological advancement to a new entrant into your business from the very outset, or more recently, trade policy, or some sort of sudden policy that no one could have predicted, right? And all of a sudden it changes things, not overnight, but like in the moment, instantaneously. And we haven't been trained to think about that. We haven't thought about that. So the story I'm going to tell you is about a big, large organization that has been trying to operate in this world differently. And Mary Barra, about 4 years ago came out and said, we anticipate that we will change more, this industry will change more in the next 5 years than it has in the last 50. And I would say about 3 years into that statement, it had already come true. Maybe even less than that. It maybe was already true whenever it came out of her mouth. And just think about this for a moment. Uber is 8, Lyft is 7. When you think about Uber's existence in the world of actually getting something on the streets as a scalable platform, they're 8 years old in the marketplace. 70% of U.S. travelers, U.S. business travelers, that market is dominated, that U.S. business traveler market is dominated. 70% of it is owned by either Lyft or Uber. I mean, that's astounding to me. Two organizations that didn't even exist really 7 years ago, 8 years ago. Where are taxi cabs in that equation today? Does anyone know? It's almost absent, like 6% in just a few rural areas where the presence hasn't dominated. The world's changing, and we see that. We experience that. You'll know that whenever you see new entrants migrating in. You'll know that whenever you see companies like Intel invest $15 billion in a sensor technology for autonomous mobility, being Mobileye, and you'll know real quickly something weird's happening, and you better pay attention. Something's about ready to break loose, and the world outside may be moving faster, so you better prepare yourself. We've got 21st century technology colliding head-on, speeds and norms colliding head-on with maybe even 19th century institutions and rules. A lot of gunk people. We could tell gunk stories all day long, and we all know them. You're not them, of course, right? But we all know who they are. And we've got this sort of collision between what I call the supertanker, or the freight carrier, if you will, the freight liner, this collision between these large entities. And by the way, these things are incredibly valuable. They carry cargo. They carry lots of cargo, as a matter of fact. And the speedboats. And every organization, and I was partially interested in this academically about a decade and a half ago. We were interested in why do some organizations respond quickly? Why are some organizations adaptive and can move fast? And other organizations, large organizations, can't and actually end up becoming extinct. What's the difference between those two? And what we discovered, the first thing we discovered was really quite simple. And that is every organization we looked at, and we were looking at large complex organizations. We looked at about 60 different companies, all Fortune 500 companies. And what we found was every organization had freight liners, and every organization had speedboats. We call these speedboats accelerators or incubators, or this small little design team of innovators are doing some design. They're all there. Every organization is trying to innovate. But there was a third element that we discovered later. But I want to talk about how the reality is. You're probably more predisposed to be a speedboat person, or you wouldn't be here. And you could go into what I call system rage. You know, what we would discover every time that we had these discussions with people and we're interviewing people is we would ask this simple question: tell us about an idea, you know, that got market success, that got, you know, was commercialized and actually showed some market success. And they would tell us about all the people that were engaged in that idea, and they would start adding more and more names every time. Then we would ask them, tell us about an idea that you liked maybe as much as that idea, but it never saw the light of day. And then they would tell us, go talk to Frank. We go talk to Frank, and Frank would go into full-blown system rage, and he would start screaming about all the idiots that control the super tanker, and he would start raging about why it is that if they would only listen to him, things would have been better around here. And what we discovered is this is a social challenge. This is a social challenge. And my story is going to be about how do you accelerate innovation by thinking about it more as a social challenge than a technological one. This was a financial services company that we have mapped out. This was a financial services company where you can see, you know, the big red dots up in the upper left-hand side were, you know, the mothership, if you will. Then the smaller entity, and this was only one subset of a fairly large acquisition, the smaller group down in the bottom left-hand side, your bottom right-hand side, was in fact the acquired company. And I don't know how many of you have been engaged in, you know, acquisitions, but what do you think? This is about 5 months into this acquisition. What do you think the small blue dots are saying at this stage? Anyone? What do you think they're saying? They're saying, get the resume updated. You know, these people are idiots. Why do we ever make this arrangement? And it's not like it used to be. And in fact, in this particular case, you know, this larger company acquired that smaller company for its entrepreneurial ingenuity, right? You know, and we all know how that lands, right? We all know how that ends. In fact, this was exactly how it started. The only people that are actually connected here, the small group of maybe 8 or 9 people in the center there, were on the integration team. They had to be connected. And this is 5 months in, right? They had to be connected. So you felt this system rage, and this was doomed. This was a marriage doomed for disaster. But then something it was a mistake, clearly a mistake. Nobody knew how to reap the benefits of the entrepreneurial engine of this highly creative organization that was acquired. No one knew how to do that. But what they did recognize was this: all wasn't lost. There were some super talented people inside of those blue dots in that little blue engine, if you will. So what they decided to do, since it didn't work from an entrepreneurial standpoint, is we're just going to extract the top talented people and we're going to move them into bigger roles, which is what happened post-merger. This is about 18 months later. What do you think started happening? All of a sudden, the very same innovations that they bought that organization for started to pop all over the organization. This was discovered purely by mistake. Just so happened we were able to map this out and come back later, and all of a sudden the story turned good, and these people, innovation started to pop all over the place. So we started to think this might be as much of a social phenomenon as it is a technological one, or, you know, an intellectual one, if you will, in this case. So back to my speedboats and super tankers. One of the things that doesn't happen inside of organizations is we don't connect these speedboats up in such a manner that we can coordinate the activities that are happening so that they can actually grow in mass and in impact to such an extent that that freight liner will actually take them seriously. You know, and in addition to that, we don't think about what are the bridges between, you know, remember that small set of blue dots and that big set of red, pink dots? We don't think about what are the bridges between those two entities before we ever step out. What we do is we create incubators, we create accelerators, we toss them out there, and we say, hurry up and grow the business so that it's got to be in the return column and we can take you seriously. That never works. Even if, in fact, you do generate something beneficial, it still doesn't work. You need to connect these things. That's what we later called adaptive space. So it'll make more sense when I share my little video here. That's how it really works. Two crazy people have an idea. They decide to catapult themselves into the brick wall or the steamliner wall. And this is what it really works like. If somebody doesn't open up the hatch on the other side, you could be in trouble. So the reality is it takes both. It takes a lot of work on the speedboats, and I'll talk about that. But the bottom line is it takes a little bit of both. If you don't loosen up the super tanker, it's never going to receive people in. And that's a social phenomenon. If somebody from inside doesn't open up that hatch, you're never getting your idea through the door. So you got to think about both in conjunction, and that's a story I want to share with you as we think about what we've been able to do and what I've seen other organizations do. And to do that, you need to think about different social arrangements. And much of this I learned from Rob, and the wonderful work Rob has done over the years with a little bit of a different spin on some language. But discovery connections are really critical on the front end. That's how we learn. That's how we discover. That's where we get new ideas. That's where new insights come from. And those hardly ever happen inside of the super tankers. You've got to get outside. You've got to become non-insular and find out what's happening in the outside world. But that's not enough. It is true that we can discover more insights, up to 20% more insights with certain sets of network configurations. But that's not enough. You've got to get those ideas into the world. Ideas are cheap. And ideation, we call that oftentimes, right? You got to get them into the super tanker. And to do that, you've got to develop them. This is where agile design really, truly is critical. This is where we need to think about how do we move fast? How do we cycle and iterate and experiment in rapid fashion to be able to bring those ideas to life so that we're actually now arguing for something that's real as opposed to a philosophical idea. But that's not enough, because what we know is that those ideas are generally rejected by the super tanker. Lee Flemings has done some work and said that up to 43% of the time, those ideas are rejected when they're designed in these small little pockets inside of an organization. So you've got to find a way to get them diffused. And I think Rob's work around energizers and brokers is critical. It's essential to this. Energizers help to get other people's ideas lifted up inside of the organization, and they really help to get them amplified so that the super tanker is at least willing to open up that door to a different degree. And then those three add up to something we'll call disruption. And the combination of those three sets of different social arrangements help you to become more disruptive inside of a large, mature, scalable business. Now, that's a little bit of the background. This is how it really works right here. This is my favorite network diagram. This is how it really works, right? Ideas happen at the intersections of very sort of diverse arrangements of groups. And you've got to find the people that are willing to take a risk. There's your broker. You've got to find the people that are willing to take the risk and literally bridge gaps in order to discover what one group knows that another group doesn't. You've got to do this inside and outside of organizations, and that's what it takes to really gain new insights as you're thinking about discovery connections. And if you don't believe me in the animal kingdom, here is a real network diagram of Apple. This was actually taken, this was a snapshot of patent data taken in 2012, and you can see the person right here. I don't have a pointer on this. You can see where Steve Jobs is in this network diagram. Steve Jobs was not necessarily the most connected person in Apple inside of their patent network. Reality is Steve Jobs was positioned perfectly as a broker. Steve Jobs had less connections than many of the people did in these deep pockets, but Steve Jobs was a broker. So the argument could be made, while we think of Jobs as this very smart, visionary leader, brilliant innovator, his network was doing much of the work for him. In this particular case, he could think about how to diffuse that, but it's also true externally. How do you think about those bridge connections outside? We were interested in reimagining personal transportation for city dwellers. So we were interested in what would it look like to look inside of the urban environment. If you know the statistics, if you know what's happening with the demographics, you know that in the developed worlds, 70% of the world's population already lives inside of urban cities. We sell a lot of trucks in the center of the country, so that might be a problem. And here's what makes it a bigger problem. The world is growing at 1.84% on an annual basis. Essentially, all of that world's growth is happening inside of urban environments. So that number is continuing to grow and continuing to grow. So we were interested in this problem because this is a customer group that's outside of our insular bubble. This was a customer group that we may not pay a whole lot of attention to because it's not a day-to-day customer we interact with. So we went out and we were using design thinking methodologies. We were interested in reimagining this whole urban transportation thing, and we met Ann and Susan, two twins. We were actually in Palo Alto whenever we met them. We later replicated this in many, many other places. And what we found was something we all know. I mean, this isn't like a dramatic insight, but what we discovered was for all kinds of reasons, people can't, or won't own a vehicle inside of a city. It turns out that it may actually be as much of a burden, so Ann told us, to own a vehicle inside of a city as it is a benefit. Now that may be a problem when you sell cars, right? That could be a little bit of a problem. But this group actually delved into that challenge, and from that insight, from that simple insight, and then multiple interviews across all of the United States, they basically designed a solution for it, which is through networking for discovery by getting outside of their insular bubble, which we call Maven. Maven is a peer-to-peer sharing platform, unlike Lyft and Uber, who are basically car sharing platforms where the car comes to you. You go to the car, but this is how you can travel. There's a dead spot right now in mobility in regards to a vehicle can come to you in ride sharing, but if you need a vehicle for a longer period of time, you don't have much access to it. And Maven basically became a peer-to-peer sharing platform, it is now, to where you can share your car, which is a sunken asset. I probably shouldn't tell you this out loud, but somewhere about 95 to 96% of your vehicle's ownership is sitting idle right now, like your vehicle is today, right now. I'm presuming you own one. It's sitting idle right now as an unutilized asset. This is a way to think about the gig economy in a whole different way. How do you deploy that asset? And you don't discover that unless you get out and create discovery connections. But we also need them inside. We also need to discover things inside, and we need to create our own watering holes so that we can share within the organization. And that's what we've been doing with Discovery Summits. Discovery Summits are a group of volunteers that come together. We're doing these a couple times a year now. They come together basically around a business challenge. When we first did this, we invited 60 people in the room. The last one we did, and again, all volunteers, the last one we did around the business challenge, 1,000 people signed up in 24 hours, and we were at occupancy. We had to turn people away because people have loved these so much. What they are is they're giant brokerage fest. My favorite story is right here. You can see these people had ideas, and hopefully there's no safety people in the room, but I got yelled at for this picture actually. We have people standing up on chairs screaming out their idea, literally banging chairs up against the wall to get people's attention, to pay attention to their idea. And that's what it looks like to create these brokerage fests inside of organizations in order to, again, traverse across the isolated pockets so that you can share ideas. And I'll continue to tell this story as I move forward, throughout the rest of this presentation. That's what it looks like on the network, where you're building bridges across these entities so that, in fact, you can learn and discover new insights in such a way that you don't see them every single day. It's much like the story we saw with putting people in the RV across functions and having them go out and solve a problem. And you can do that live inside these large group interventions to sort of streamline it inside the organization. Who's this guy? But that's not enough. I already told you. Who's this guy? And what did he discover? I gave you the answer, by the way. I gave you the answer. It's late in the day, I know. But I bet you haven't heard a whole lot about these guys, and they were all guys, sorry. I bet you haven't heard a whole lot about these guys. This was the cohesive band of muckers. Remember, ideas are cheap. You can discover them all day long. If you can't bring them into the world, they're useless. And Thomas Edison could be thought of as the central connector inside of a group of muckers that were able to iterate and experiment. He was agile before agile was vogue. And they were able, in the invention factory at Menlo Labs, they were able to iterate many, many times on all kinds of inventions in a very short time frame. And again, this was a network challenge because these folks knew each other. They lived with each other every day. It was a bit of a coarse environment. There was friction in this environment. And that friction was healthy friction because they challenged each other to see things from their own lens and area of expertise, which is one of the reasons it was so ripe for great inventions. Well, you can take that same logic and bring something else into the world. This is Cruise Automation. This is our self-driving vehicle play just up the street in San Francisco. This is the network of Cruise, and what you can see right away is these are small little groups of teams. You know, I saw John Golden earlier. These are small, Amazon calls them 2 pizza teams, small 2 pizza teams, you know, that are agilely designing on a day-to-day basis. You know, they all have different things. There's a sensor component there. There's a geo-mapping component there. There's a group that's, you know, looking at the experience inside of the vehicle. And every single day what happens is you see these crazy little vehicles driving around, 150 of them on the streets of San Francisco. Every single day what happens is they're downloading, they're pulling, you know, the data bank out of these vehicles. It's collecting 1.5 terabytes of data, plugging it into the central BAT, and they're iterating on the algorithms, and then they're syncing these things up so that they can generate, you know, a self-driving vehicle that knows the streets better than anything else. And that's happened in about an 18-month time frame. We've created 4 generations of technology using this methodology. And you can move up to 20% faster, 20 times faster, by having these small 2 pizza teams. This is more typical on the right-hand side. This is an internal development team, a more traditional development team. You'll notice a difference in the 2 designs. One is very fast and moves with speed. It's integrated to where the speedboats are connected with each other. On the far right-hand side is the Heads Are Bets platform. So this is actually a development organization about the same size, but the difference between those 2 network diagrams is one's designed to iterate, the other one's designed to hedge their bets. In this one, each person has 1 task. In this one over here, each person has 3 or 4 things they're working on with 3 or 4 different groups. Why? Because they don't know which one's going to hit. They don't know which one's going to be valuable to the organization, so they're literally hedging their bets, and every time they shift to a different group, there's a shifting cost which causes a delay and slows down the organization. So I'm here to say that when it comes to development, thinking about the left-hand side of this chart more intentionally than the right-hand side of this chart, intentionally thinking about clusters and even having more silos in your organization might make sense. But that's not enough. Remember, you've got to continue to bring those things into the world. You don't always have to do that on a network. You know, we continuing this whole, you know, brokerage fest thing. You know, once ideas come out of there, we've got to find a way to stand them up. We've got to find a way to bring them into the world. So we do these 24-hour hackathons, which we call CoLabs, which basically brings groups in, much like what you saw with that group of 2 pizza teams. We bring groups in, we have them all take on a given challenge, and that challenge is same for all of them. They're competing with each other, and at the end of 24 hours, they're standing those ideas up in a prototype. And in that prototype, what's happening is am I getting weird messages again? So in that prototype, what's happening is they're competing against each other to get those things embedded into the organization. But now they're bringing them into the world in a whole different level. You can also stretch that time frame out. And one of the ways we've been able to do that is through something we call Synapse. You know, this previous one was 24 hours. This one stretches it out into more intricate designs and development activities, you know, across a time frame of maybe more like 3 months. And this last one was actually about how do you drive adoption of electric vehicles? How do you drive the adoption equivalent up of electric vehicles? And to do that, it's far more nuanced, and you can't do that in 24 hours. But you can, and here's the main thing I want to focus on with development. You can iterate much more rapidly than what you do with the traditional design process. It takes us about 3 to 4 years to design a vehicle. You know, if you're trying to design something that's moving that much faster in the outside world, you better use a different model to figure out how to do it. And that really happens in 3 ways. You assemble small teams, you give them a single purpose. Amazon calls them single-threaded teams so that everybody knows what they're focused on. And then you give them very tight milestones to where you know, in fact, and this is a lot of the teaming concept, you know when they hit a milestone, or when they don't, they just decommission and weave themselves into a different team. That's what development connections look like. Who's this guy? Anyone know who this guy is?
Yeah,
Alibaba. So if I were to say, you know, this is a rock star, you would say nothing so strange about that. If I would have told you that this is a CEO or was a CEO of the largest internet company on planet Earth, you know, lip syncing a rock song to 16,000 people in Yellow Dragon Stadium, you might think he's crazy, right? In fact, that's what they call him, Crazy Jack. But what Crazy Jack was really doing numerous years ago was trying to fire up his team. They knew, and whenever this actually happened, he knew that eBay was moving in. eBay was moving into China, and he knew that he had to energize the troops. He knew that he had to energize the folks around him to believe that there was something possible, something different possible. And to do that, they had to be scrappy, they had to be energized, and they had to try things and iterate very, very frequently. What he was trying to do was energize people up to try new things, to break the norms, and basically what he argued for here was, you know, if we're the crocodile in the river, we'll beat the sharks in the ocean, which was eBay coming over. We know the rest of the story. He's now the richest man in China. And in fact, you know, Alibaba has done exactly what he set out for, maybe even more. And he did that by energizing. That is critical to diffusion. It's critical to getting your ideas amplified throughout the organization. Your network position in that if you're a broker and you can, you know, span across different groups is essential. But it's also important to buzz up and energize the organization. And what we found is that if you drop people into a toxic team, much like that first picture, if you drop them into that toxic team, they are disengaged 3x more likely. In an 18-month time frame, they are disengaged 3x more than if you drop somebody into a team like this. And it's serious business when you're thinking about getting ideas out there. Turns out, and this is a real group, this is 750 people that we mapped together. There are 2 super energizers inside this particular network, 750 people. I lit up only 2 people here because they were truly the super energizers. Turns out that just 2 people were able to light up 23% of this network. Why? Because they believed that they could do anything. Why? Because they believed that their ideas were going to be accepted. And again, Rob's taught us a lot about this. Those folks become contagious to other folks. And you know, unlike the energy vampires that also become contagious and suck the life out of you, these folks become contagious in a positive way. And they're able to lift ideas up. So why would we not think about how do we leverage these people? Why would we not think about how do we think of that as a critical asset to getting ideas from these small pockets inside the organization, the small speedboats inside of the organization, scaled into the supertanker, and to buzz up the organization about ideas and to create positive gossip and reputation across the network. And you can do that. You just have to seed the network to make it happen. One of the ways we do that is in an auditorium just like this. Once a year, what we do is something we call tipping forward. Tipping forward is used in sort of Pechakuchu style, you know, 4 minutes apiece. We march people up on a stage like this. They each have 4 minutes, you know, for a whole hour long. They have 4 minutes to share an idea, something that they've worked on throughout the year, something that they brought into the world. And sitting out there were only energizers. Sitting out in the audience was a seated network of energizers that we've been able to identify in advance that we bring into the room so that they're more predisposed to pick up these ideas and amplify them out. Immediately after, one year, immediately after, we created this like living museum of activities where the folks who presented their ideas did like an old science fair outside in a different foyer, and they were actually able to share those ideas, and the energizers just literally buzzed up around them, and they started to amplify those ideas in such a way that they were able to get them pushed out into the organization. And I could talk about all kinds of different things, you know, that happened. One of my favorite stories was an innovation with a digital windshield that's still being played around with that came out from, you know, a few folks presenting on the stage and a few other people looking for an application for an idea that, you know, was trying to find a home. And you can do that by seeding your network in a much more intentional manner than what we tend to do. But that's a different configuration. You know, development is getting something built. Then you've got to get it scaled. You've got to get it diffused. That's where the energizers and brokers come back together to help. But again, you got to get into the supertanker, right? At the end of the day, you've got to get into the supertanker. And this is where another type of friction is healthy. And the friction here, which leads to disruption, is somebody who I call a challenger, who actually starts to ask the challenging questions that will help this thing stand up and get liftoff sooner. One of my favorite analogies, and Bob's heard me tell this analogy, is a Boeing 757. For a Boeing 757 to get takeoff, it has to hit airspeed of 180 miles per hour. So the natural thought process is, I want to get a tailwind behind me to push me off sooner, right? Well, those of us who understand, I don't understand this, but an aerodynamic engineer would say, no, you charge into the headwind. You charge straight into the wind because you get liftoff sooner. It only takes 150 miles of land speed in a 30 mile per hour headwind to get liftoff sooner. That's what disruption looks like. That's what a challenger does. A challenger helps to bring ideas through the supertanker so that they can be scaled more readily. And they do that by asking lots of questions. This happens later in the process. If it's happening before you even believe in your idea, if it's happening as a killer bee when you're presenting your idea at first and you don't even have social proof that you believe in your idea, this prematurely will kill an idea. But later in the cycle, getting very intentional about adding some challenges later when you're trying to scale an idea actually becomes highly beneficial. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. One of the ways we've been able to do that is in another partnership with Stanford, is we created a transformational leadership program. I'm sorry you can't see that here. It should have been dimmed down a little bit better. But you see a network on the left-hand side. We actually run a group of people through a cohort. These are very senior people. We're using them to challenge and disrupt the business. Once a year, we send 35 almost like officer potential people through this cohort. What we're doing is really two things. We're exposing them to the disruptive forces around them. So we're bringing them outside of their own vacuum. We're exposing them to different markets so that they can see the disruptions that are happening in this industry. But we're also connecting them to one another. Why? Because when you're on the other side of the supertanker, if you want to open that hatch, you may have to contact 3 or 4 different groups to usher someone in. So we're building these relationships. That's pre-session, a group of people that knew each other a little. This is immediately post-session a year later. And we quadrupled the density of that network. And 2 years after that program had concluded, same cohort, and again, you can't see it very well here, 2 years after the post-graduation session, over 2/3 of that network continued to remain intact. Now, why does that matter? Like, why do I care about that? It's interesting, right? It's interesting that you can build social capital face-to-face and you can sustain it virtually, but there's another reason why it matters far more importantly from a business standpoint. Now I know who to partner with. And it turns out, I don't have them all here, but it turns out if I look at those natural clusters, I can actually go spot innovations throughout the organization that these small groups have built based on the relationships that were forged in this event and based on building other connections deep inside the organization to sort of disrupt the way that we do business. And here's the best illustration I can give of that. That small bubble right there is the team that invented this. That small bubble is a group of people that actually, on their own, cross-functional group of people that were interested in reimagining luxury transportation inside of the automotive industry. And it turns out that, and again, this is something that's happening across many industries, but certainly pronounced inside mine, it turns out that luxury is beginning to age out. These luxury brands are not something that's appealing to, the generation that's, rising up in purchasing power, right? And I didn't know this existed until I was playing around down again on Stanford campus, that there's something called luxury guilt. Luxury guilt is this, and somebody told me this. We're interviewing people, doing some empathy, and a young lady says, well, I wouldn't do that. That's kind of like luxury guilt. I'm like, well, what's that? And she says, if I actually sunk all my money into, that vehicle or, that big house or, that other, big vacation, high-end vacation trip, that's money that I couldn't put into something that's more purposeful or more meaningful to me at the individual value level. We call that luxury guilt. So you can tap into that, and it ends up that people want access to, by the way, these folks, just like we, are hypocritical, because they still want access to luxury. They just don't want to pay it. They just don't want the sunken, their sunken resources long-term in a $70,000, $80,000 vehicle, but they still want access to it. Well, that's a solution that's a problem waiting for a solution. So this group, actually, that small cohesive group I showed you a few slides ago, actually launched out into the world and created a prototype, and we ended up calling it Book by Cadillac, and the prototype is simply this. What if you bought a subscription service to a luxury brand, and you could have access to any vehicle in that fleet when you need it, high-end concierge service, and you could decide when to cut it at any point in time. So you may want to do it for 3 months and decide you're done, and that's fine. I mean, it is not the cheapest of services, but the reality is it's sold. 50, we had a slot, we did a beta test. We had room to actually test this with 50 people because it's a huge logistics challenge, you can imagine. You know, getting vehicles across the city to people. 8,000 people signed up in the first few days. Then we had to shut it off real quickly and say, wait a minute, we weren't that serious about this. But you know, you may have hit a problem in the marketplace if you in fact can provide a solution and that many people show up. It turns out that we have scaled this and continue to scale this, but this would not have happened if these people didn't forge that relationship with each other and they weren't able to navigate across the organization and break down some stereotypes that exist around ownership versus access. And that was a network solution. It was much less about the solution we plugged in, and it was much more about the influence and ability of those people being spread across the blue dots, of being able to influence at different points to be able to bring this into the world. Otherwise, it would have gotten killed in the undertow of the supertanker. So finally, let me put this all together for you. We have operational systems. We have, you know, the supertankers. We have entrepreneurial pockets, all these ideas that are happening. But you've got to actually think about a set of orchestrated moves to get things from these small pockets into this new operating system so they can be scaled, operational system, so they can be scaled. So what we've been doing is systematically plugging in little activities. You know, I've already talked about each of these, collabs, you know, summits. Summits are, you know, great for brokerage. Collab helps to bring things into the world. Synapse helps with development. Diffusion happens through things like the Tipping Forward and Catalyst camps that we hold every year, where we're trying to seed ideas into the network and get them diffused out. And if you can think of a set of orchestrated interventions as a means to actually getting ideas from one pocket, pulled up into the organization and diffused and scaled, you know, you can make some significant movement forward, even in a fairly solidified organization. And that's what we've been able to do. This is something we called GM 2020 that we've pivoted away from, and we were thrilled whenever Fast Company picked this up a couple years ago and told this story for us. And it basically talked about, you know, how you can actually, you know, be a large company and scale faster. But, you know, the brutal truth is that this is hard work. The reality is, you know, we can sit up here and talk about the intentionality of using networks. We can talk about the intentionality of plugging in different solutions. And this is brutal, tough, hard work. And, you know, I've got bruises all up and down my back, and there are hundreds of people who have done this with me. And I have to tell you that it truly is like charging head on into that supertanker. But it can be done. It can't be done alone. It can't be done as one person. It can't be done even from a top-down perspective. You know, in fact, I would say that top-down change doesn't happen in this way because, you know, the middle of an organization is usually far more skilled at squelching out and stifling change than the top is as. But if you actually tap into the power of the network, they will overcome all the naysayers and the killer bees, and you can actually leverage the network to drive significant change inside the company. So that's my story.